And also, I loved all of his gospel songs too, and meeting him was, at that point, high.
For over half a century, Bob Dylan has been the most enigmatic figure in American music. An oracle draped in denim, a poet wrapped in riddles, a voice that rasped through generations, yet revealed so little of itself. His lyrics shook presidents, ignited countercultures, and inspired Nobel Prizes. But behind that gravelly voice and elusive persona lies a truth few have ever uncovered. Where did Dylan truly come from musically? Fans and critics have speculated endlessly, dissecting every verse, every chord, every breath, searching for fingerprints, for a glimpse of the artists that shaped him. For decades, Dylan played coy, dodging questions with cryptic one-liners, offering only glimpses through misted glass. But now, as he stands at 84, the veil begins to lift. In rare interviews, liner notes, and offhand comments, Dylan has finally, quietly, revealed the 6 bands and artists that molded his soul, re-engineered his voice, and detonated the explosive genius that changed modern music forever. These weren't just influences, they were obsessions, spiritual mentors, and in some cases, lifelong ghosts that haunted his melodies. And what's more shocking is that most fans would never expect some of the names on this list. This isn't just a story of who Dylan liked, it's a roadmap to understanding how an awkward small-town kid with a harmonica became a cultural force of nature. From mountain hollers to electric revolutions, this is the hidden musical DNA of Bob Dylan. And once you hear it, you'll never listen to him the same way again. Before the world knew his name, before protest anthems echoed through college campuses, before the Nobel Committee ever considered honoring a songwriter, Bob Dylan was just a young dreamer in Minnesota haunted by a sound far older than himself. It wasn't rock and roll or pop radio that first gripped his spirit. It was the eerie, high, lonesome wail of the Stanley Brothers. Carter and Ralph Stanley, 2 humble bluegrass musicians from Virginia, reached across miles and decades to touch the soul of a teenager with nothing but dusty records and a hunger for something real. While other kids were tuning in to Elvis or doo-wop, Dylan was digging through the roots of America's forgotten soundscape. He once described Carter Stanley's voice as an ancient bell that had been ringing in the mountains for 1,000 years. And that haunting metaphor says everything. The Stanley Brothers didn't just sing songs, they summoned ghosts, channeled pain, and translated the Appalachian hills into harmony. For Dylan, their music was a sacred text, not meant to entertain but to transform. This wasn't showbiz, it was survival. Songs like Man of Constant Sorrow on Dylan's debut album weren't just homages, they were confessions. A young artist trying to carry the weight of a tradition he never lived but deeply felt. What Dylan learned from the Stanleys was that music doesn't need polish or perfection, it needs truth. And truth, in its purest form, often comes from the fringes, not the center. That lesson would echo through every line Dylan ever wrote. Their influence was so profound that it gave him permission to be raw, to be strange, to sound like he came from a different time. And in many ways, he did. The Stanley Brothers didn't just shape Dylan's sound, they shaped his ethic. From them, he learned that authenticity is louder than volume, and that sometimes the quietest voices carry the oldest truths. If the Stanley Brothers gave Dylan a sense of place, it was Hank Williams who gave him a sense of purpose. The first time Dylan heard "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry," it wasn't just a song, it was a revelation. He described it as being struck by lightning, and in that electric jolt came the understanding that music wasn't just entertainment. It was confession. It was literature. It was prayer. Hank Williams wasn't polished or theatrical. He was vulnerable, bruised, and broken in the most beautiful way. Where most country singers clung to tropes and toe-tapping cliches, Williams bled onto vinyl, carving sorrow into melody and turning heartbreak into universal gospel. Dylan, still a teenager in Hibbing, Minnesota, listened to late-night radio broadcasts from the Grand Ole Opry and found in Hank's voice a doorway to something deeper than genre. It was the rawness, the lyrical simplicity, the brutal emotional honesty that captivated him. Years later, Dylan would say that Williams taught him songs could be literature, not because they used big words or clever metaphors, but because they revealed the most human truths with devastating clarity. You can hear Hank's ghost in Dylan's storytelling, from Tangled Up in Blue to Simple Twist of Fate, where every line is soaked in loss, regret, longing. But what made Hank so revolutionary to Dylan wasn't just what he sang, it was how he lived. A man who could barely hold himself together, yet somehow held the nation's attention through 3-minute tragedies. That duality of strength in collapse became a cornerstone of Dylan's art, and even as Dylan grew into myth and legend, it was Hank's brutal honesty that remained the blueprint. In Williams, Dylan saw not just a singer, but a mirror, a man who showed him that being broken didn't mean being weak, it meant being real. And in that truth, Dylan found the courage to start writing his own. While the Stanley Brothers gave him roots and Hank Williams gave him wounds, it was the Everly Brothers who gave Dylan wings. Two voices that seemed to defy physics, floating in perfect unison, always one breath ahead of the other. When Dylan first heard Don and Phil Everly harmonizing on Bye Bye Love, he was mesmerized. These weren't just harmonies, they were spell work. The Everlys took Appalachian melancholy, injected it with rock and roll adrenaline, and produced something wholly new, something that sounded like the past and future colliding. What fascinated Dylan most was not just their sound but their synchronicity. He once said it was like hearing one person with two souls, and that eerie closeness left a lasting impression. Dylan absorbed that lesson deeply, even as his own voice was more gravel than grace. It wasn't about sounding pretty. It was about emotional intimacy, about capturing a moment so clearly that it hurt. You can trace their fingerprints across Dylan's electric phase in songs like I Want You and Just Like a Woman, where the emotional complexity is tucked into deceptively simple melodies. But more than music, the Everlys taught Dylan the art of blending, of taking country, gospel, and rock, and not choosing between them, but fusing them into something revolutionary. Their ability to keep one foot in tradition while pushing the other into new sonic territories gave Dylan a roadmap for reinvention. The Everly Brothers didn't preach change, they embodied it. And Dylan, ever the shapeshifter, followed their lead. In their music, he found permission to evolve, to contradict himself, to be both tender and fierce in the same breath. They didn't just teach him how to sing, they taught him how to grow. Then came Buddy Holly, the bespectacled prophet from Texas, who changed everything in just 22 short years. Dylan saw him perform live mere days before that fatal plane crash, and what he witnessed wasn't just a show, it was a sermon in freedom. Holly did it all, wrote, arranged, played, recorded, at a time when most artists were just puppets on the label's strings. For Dylan, it was as if the shackles had been shattered. Here was someone who controlled his sound, who sang with swagger but wrote with heart, who proved that rock and roll didn't have to be dumb or disposable. Holly's songs were clever but never pretentious, rebellious but never reckless. He was the middle finger with a melody, and Dylan took notes. That DIY spirit became the backbone of Dylan's early career. From his guerrilla-style recordings to his refusal to play by anyone's rules. Not the industry's, not the media's, not even the audience's. You can hear Holly's cadence in subterranean homesick blues, in the Spitfire delivery and smart-ass grin hiding behind every lyric. But more than style, Buddy Holly represented possibility. Dylan later said Holly made it seem like someone like him could do this. That an outsider, a weirdo, A kid with a notebook and a dream could shape the world with songs. Holly's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a transfer of torch. And Dylan, barely out of high school, picked it up and ran straight into the storm. If all these other artists were stars in Dylan's constellation, then the band was the galaxy he came to orbit. What began as a backing group during his controversial Electric Tour in 1965 soon evolved into one of the most symbiotic collaborations in music history. The band, 5 scrappy, soulful musicians, weren't just hired guns. They were kindred spirits who shared Dylan's hunger for something more elemental, more honest, more American than anything on the radio. They met at a crossroad. Dylan, tired of the folk purist pressure, and the band, ready to shed their rockabilly skin. Together, they reinvented the very idea of music. In the basement of a house in Woodstock, they recorded what would become the Basement Tapes, a blueprint for what we now call Americana. There was no producer, no pressure, no pretense. Just raw songs, deep grooves, and laughter. Dylan once said they were the best band he ever worked with. And it wasn't just because of their skill. It was because of their intuition. They didn't follow him. They felt him. Songs like I Shall Be Released and Tears of Rage weren't just Dylan's. They were theirs. And in that collaboration, Dylan found something priceless. Creative freedom without solitude. The band showed him that reinvention didn't have to be lonely. That sometimes the best ideas come when you stop trying to control them. Together, they proved that rock and roll could have roots, that tradition and rebellion weren't enemies, but brothers. And for Dylan, it was the closest thing to musical family he ever had. Then came the bombshell, the Beatles. At first, Dylan dismissed them as bubble gum, 4 mop-headed Brits singing about holding hands. But what he didn't see coming was how quickly they would evolve. Within a year, they went from pop stars to revolutionaries. Dylan, already hailed as a prophet, suddenly found himself face to face with an artistic challenge unlike anything before. The Beatles were doing what he thought only he could do, breaking rules, bending genres, expanding minds. Rubber Soul shattered his expectations, and in response, Dylan created Blonde on Blonde, a fever dream of lyrical complexity and sonic experimentation. It wasn't rivalry, it was a dialogue. Dylan introduced them to depth. They introduced him to sound. Norwegian Wood wouldn't exist without Like a Rolling Stone. And Dylan's embrace of electric wouldn't have felt so urgent without the Beatles breathing down his neck. Their 1964 and 1965 meetings weren't just celebrity hangouts, they were chemical reactions. Mutual respect turned into a creative arms race, and music was never the same. The Beatles taught Dylan that popularity didn't mean compromise. It meant amplification, that you could still challenge the world even if the world was watching. And so he did. When you stitch together these 6 names, the Stanley Brothers, Hank Williams, the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly, the band, and the Beatles, you don't just get a list of influences. You get a map, a hidden framework for understanding. One of the most complicated, contradictory, and brilliant artists of all time. Each one gave Dylan something specific. The Stanleys gave him roots. Hank gave him pain. The Everlys gave him harmony. Holly gave him freedom. The band gave him collaboration. And the Beatles gave him a reason to push further. These weren't just musicians. These were mentors, ghosts, guides. And Dylan, the eternal sponge, soaked them all up and alchemized them into something wholly new. That's the real genius. Not that Dylan was original in the way we imagine, but that he was honest enough to be a thief with a mission. He borrowed with reverence, then rewrote the rules. He showed us that art isn't about pretending you're born of nothing. It's about owning the lineage and daring to go further. These 6 bands weren't just his foundation. They were his wings. And now that we know who stood behind Dylan's curtain, the question becomes, who stands behind today's icons? In a world flooded with noise, algorithms, and endless playlists, are there still artists listening deeply, honoring the past while shaping the future? Or are we losing that sacred chain of influence? Dylan's story reminds us that genius doesn't emerge from a vacuum. It's born in record stores, late-night radio, live shows that change your life in 3 minutes flat. It's born in listening. So maybe the next Dylan is out there right now, poring over old vinyl, scribbling lyrics in a notebook, trying to find their voice by echoing someone else's. And if you're watching this, maybe, just maybe, that next Dylan could be you.